I'd first like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose lands the Australian National University operates, and pay our respect to the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, past, present, and emergent. So I was lucky enough to be asked to teach a bunch of subjects at the ANU School of History over the last couple of years. I taught Nazi Germany, terror to terrorism, the Cold War, Clash of Empires, 20th Century War, basically all the depressing, sad ones that they needed someone to go through and liven them up a bit. I also taught international relations at the ANU College, stepping in week 8 in the middle of a course when I'd never taught international relations before. The students had studied more international relations than I had, but I decided to give it a go anyway, so I have a bit of experience in those areas. I was, as was said, lucky enough to receive the College of Arts and Social Sciences and the Vice Chancellor's Tutoring Award, which have just been sort of an amazing experience to apply for those, and I'll talk a bit about that as I go on as well. So my perspective is specifically that I'm not a lecturer or a convener. I come exclusively from the tutorer's perspective, I suppose. And I suppose, if apart from trying not to be too self-indulgent, the purpose of my talk today is kind of to, I guess, give some general advice for tutoring, whether that be for people who've never tutored before, who would like to tutor, who are going back to tutoring, or who've been doing it for a long time. I will go through some of the things I saw as challenges while I was a tutor, offer some solutions to that, and talk a bit about some of the things that I decided to do to get past some of those challenges. Feel free to ask questions as you go, but I'll also have some time at the end. So the structure will go something like this, overcoming some of the challenges of tutoring history. The first case study I'll kind of go through can really be applied to just about any discipline or anything within the humanities. The second part will be unsolicited advice for basically everyone. So take that however you like, but I think bringing a tutor's perspective into some of the teaching process is something that I think is quite important. Applying for, not getting, and then getting awards. Some of the processes that I went about to receive the awards I did, but I think importantly doing some of the reflecting on that process, and then some actual self-indulgence at the end, which we'll get to. So specifically I'll look at some of the challenges of overcoming history, which is sort of an adventure of sorts I found, at least in the tutoring process. I'll go through some challenges first that I found. So the very first challenge that I found, which I think many of you who have any level of teaching experience would have, is that in effect, there can often be a small group of students, often particularly male students, who will talk over others, who will dominate class discussion in certain ways. This is a real problem going into certain subjects because it makes other students feel uncomfortable, makes them not feel as valued, and really makes them feel as if they're not able to communicate in the same ways. If this happens enough, you tend to notice that students will sort of stop bothering to respond to questions because they know that that person in the class is going to either start talking immediately or talk over other people. And I think probably people with teaching experience know that this is quite a common phenomenon. My broad way of dealing with this is to, from week 1, set the expectation that everyone in the class will speak. Everyone will have the opportunity to speak, and in the case, certainly my style of tutoring, everyone will be called on to speak every single week. Give students, what I tend to do is give them an out in this, so if you feel very uncomfortable with this particular questioning style, send me an email, we can come up with some other way to go about participation. But other than that, from week 1 onwards, call on every single student, and they effectively by week 3 or 4 just get used to it. They come to class not trying to do that thing where they're wondering, oh, if I do the readings this week, I wonder if I'll be called on, can I get away with not doing them? If you expect from week 1 that they're going to do it, they'll tend to show up either having done the readings or ready to discuss them in some way. A way I sort of went about this as well was to come up with quite specific questions per student, not necessarily, drawing up a big map and saying every single student will answer this question in this order, but specific things about the readings, which mean that you don't have those students that can effectively talk about anything, whether they've done the readings or not, coming up with questions that actually indicate that they've had some attempt at reading the materials assigned. Another part of this that I found really useful was to really moderate the discussion. It's really hard when I started tutoring when I was, I think, 21 or just turned 22. So there's actually students in the class older than you who have been at university longer. It's really hard to tell someone to stop talking at any age and at anything, but you have to do that in order to make sure class discussion is fair, to make sure people actually have a chance to discuss what's going on, and to sort of bring some equilibrium to the discussion. So that's something that I had a lot of trouble with early on, which is actually interrupting students, saying, sorry, we need to hear from someone else, but that's something I found to be particularly useful. And in my case, have either a mental list or an actual list of who has talked and who has not talked, and make sure everyone gets a chance to talk. It can often seem as if some students are too shy to respond, whereas often if you actually ask them if they've done the readings, they've done all of them, and simply haven't done what we extroverts do and tell everyone everything we know all the time. So moderating the discussions fairly and really calling on everyone is something that I've found useful, and I have tended to find that students quickly adapt to this. Even if they don't think they'll be comfortable with it from week 1 onwards, by the time they get a couple of weeks in, they just expect to be asked questions, and they tend to do the readings a bit more if this is the process. Some of the student feedback I received from this was quite good. So this is a quote that I got in 2016. So the fact that Eamonn asks specific individuals questions in the tutorial is incredibly helpful, as female voices can get overshadowed by more loud males, especially in our tutorial, so I feel included and able to express my opinion, which in turn makes the tutorial much more enjoyable for me, and deviates from the same 3 men giving their opinions on the readings. Brackets, a big plus. So I got sort of that feedback, and that's one of the reasons I've sort of tried to do this quite prescriptively. But I think the key bit is setting the expectations from week 1 that this is what this class is going to be like. If you kind of figure out by week 6 or 7, it would be good to call everyone on everyone. They haven't had those established patterns of behaviour in your class, and so I found this to be a particularly useful method. Okay, so that's a kind of a general one that can definitely be applied to lots of different cases. It might be useful in humanities or different subjects. For history, and I think probably the humanities more generally, we can get into some very tricky discussions. I pick Israel-Palestine because it's controversial, it's big, and it brings up a real problem I've had with, I taught a subject with Will over there called Terror to Terrorism, and no one wants to be the first one to weigh in on a controversial issue. Particularly first years, but even later years, I've found this to be the case. No student wants to basically look like an idiot a couple of weeks into their sort of university career. And so I've had, in the past, particularly with that subject, so many discussions where everyone sits around and sort of goes, it's a very complicated issue, and I certainly hope we come up with a solution sometime in the future. Next person. No one really wants to weigh in. No one wants to sort of get into that sort of robust academic rigory kind of discussion. And I think that's an issue because there's a lot of these kinds of issues. We're training thought leaders and leaders of the future. We need to tackle those issues in a really profound, academic, analytical kind of way. In particular, in the subject terror to terrorism, we do things like the French Revolution, anarchism, Islamist terrorism, the IRA, Israel-Palestine, the Algerian War of Independence, and white nationalism. They're all very controversial topics, and often at the start of semester in particular, students don't really want to be engaged in that. So the kind of thing that I developed as a way of getting around this problem is anonymous polling. So what I did is in week 1, I didn't do this in my first semester, I came up with it when I taught this subject a second time, is to anonymously poll every single person in all of my classes with the following question. Can violence against the state ever be justified? Yes or no, explain your answer. Yeah. We've got a hard yes in the front row there, but we'll bleep that out for convenience. The reason I did this is because this, I found with the particular course that I was teaching, was the core issue in basically every single week, because every single manifesto we read from the French Revolution onwards basically said, we tried all the democratic means up until this point, and then something happened, and then we had to use violence against the state to get our point out there. And the results I found were really fascinating per class. Some classes, 90% would say it's never justified to use violence against the state. Others would be more mixed. Others, all of them said it's fine to use violence against the state. And their sort of 1 or 2 sentence reasons often brought about really good discussion. There's a couple of reasons I found this is a really useful idea. Number one, it's anonymous, so students can hopefully at least have the opportunity to be completely honest about their opinions. you would maybe expect them to kind of go in certain directions, but they go in very much other directions, and they're unrestrained from the judgment of their peers, because it's completely anonymous. I give them different coloured pens, so I can't somehow work out who said which one. So it's completely anonymous in that way. Using the numbers and some of the arguments from, say, my first class of the week, I can then bring that up in future classes. So one of the things I find to be not necessarily a hindrance to discussion, but something that isn't that useful is a kind of consensus building. So you get to, I don't know, the third tutorial and everyone goes, it's a complicated issue, and no, we'll talk to people about it and make some sort of constructive changes. Actually bringing up some of the arguments that are written down from previous classes as to the alternate opinion, I found that to be a really useful way to engage this, because it's not me saying, well, why haven't you thought of this? I'm saying, well, actually, some of your fellow students have brought up these really interesting ideas. How do you justify your position if you factor this in? So you can actually use these on, and as the semester goes on, by the time you get to week 12 and they've done so much terror and so much terrorism, you can bring up those earlier results and then compare that to the results for that week. So usually we get to something like Islamist terrorism, and people basically go, it's no good, don't think it's justified, don't think it's useful, don't think it's a good thing politically or something that can be justified, and bring up the fact that in week 1, 90% of you said that it's justified to use violence against the state. What's caused you to think that this is different from this form of terrorism? What's caused you to think differently week 1 to week 12? And it gives them that opportunity to actually reflect on their own learning as well. So I'm not sure if that's going to be useful for sort of every single sort of class or discipline, but I found that to be a really useful workaround of the fact that basically students don't want to show up in week 1 and suddenly put themselves out there in those kinds of ways. And I found that to be a really useful method. And results in kind of positive students' experiences. Of course, we brought peace to the Middle East every single week. It was very useful. But broadly speaking, other tutors use this particular method as well, and we got really good sort of diverse student feedback for that as a result. My last kind of challenge I'll talk about broadly, links in particularly, I sort of think of first years when I think of these challenges, is it's the faster in history in particular that you can get a student to make an original argument, the better. The faster or the more efficiently you can get them into the mind frame of constructing an original thought out thesis that might use some secondary sources but is fundamentally an original idea, the better. And that's a challenge because in lots of cases students show up and they find it very difficult to disagree with professors of history at Harvard who they read about. They find it very difficult to disagree maybe with a lecturer, and they find it very difficult to disagree with the kind of bulk of literature. It's astonishing, but most students assume that the readings that you assign, you agree with all of them. That's why you picked them. You actually have to tell them in many ways to think much more critically about them and about the course and about the tutors and about the lecturers. And it takes really a whole academic career to get to that stage, but I've sort of devised a way of trying to get to that as quickly as possible. In particular, the problem of relying too heavily on secondary sources instead of making an argument, and again, being a bit too afraid to put yourself out there and make a bit of a controversial argument. So what I did was design a custom essay template for the different subjects that I did that basically goes through all the, in effect, it mirrors the rubric by going through the different things, but flips the rubric by basically saying, here are the questions you need to answer. You need to make your argument the thing foremost in your mind when you're doing this. So on the sort of A3 page, the most left column is effectively what is your overall argument and how do your 2 or 3 main points link to this main argument. Because if they've never seen this before or it's their first week at university, that's a very different way of thinking, analysing and writing an essay. And I think the faster they can get to what is my argument and how do I justify it by, in history's case, primary and secondary sources, the better. And including within that spreadsheet in there, so I have so many different ones, I didn't want to put one up specifically. What primary sources are you using to fulfill this criteria? What secondary sources? And how does this link to your overall argument? And how is your argument different or the same from the other people that have brought this up? So to actually do this effectively, I used a version of the think, pair, share technique that I learnt in the Principles of Tutoring and Demonstrating program. and basically got students to, first of all, come in with however many resources they had and write out as much as they can of their essay. It's also great if students haven't started writing their essay because they've got to start now. And then getting them to share their key arguments with the person next to them. Because it's one thing to formulate something in your head and then trying to actually explain it to the person next to you with the question, what is your key argument, pretty quickly gets to the core of what they're doing. I would then go around and while they're talking in pairs, start to review students' work individually. So this is, I suppose, back to the kind of collaborative method. In the subjects that I taught, usually students came up with their own question. So allowing them, if we look at the scale again, allowing them to come up with their own question, but then giving them some advice of how they might best go about altering that slightly to fulfill the learning outcomes. I then suggest useful resources, people that they might want to talk to, and different ways of approaching these questions. I've found in my time that this method is really, really useful because very rarely will more than 5 students per class come to see you before the major essay is due. It'll be 2 or 3, and as a lot of you probably know, it's almost always the students that don't need to actually come and talk to you that come and talk to you. It's usually the ones that are doing pretty well and want to do really well. So using this method where you're effectively having pretty quick, but definitely one-on-one consultation about their essay question and what they're doing, that tends to be really useful, I've tended to find. And you're also fostering their development as independent learners. You're revealing a bit of how their essays will be marked, and sort of all the sort of pedagogical literature shows that the more students understand what they're actually being assessed on, the better they'll do in the assessment. And the results from this were pretty good. In my kind of chip trilogy, the eating the chip at the end seems to be a good thing. Students really liked this particular week and found it really useful. They understood the assessment requirements and they were able to develop their question on their own and with peers and with me, all within a kind of one tutorial setting. It's a very frantic tutorial, but it does actually work. Students have stated in my self-feedback that this method, quote, really showed my interest in each of my students and provided a great opportunity to workshop our major assessment before the due date. And similarly, I received an unsolicited student email which said that I'm grateful for the feedback you've given me, especially on the research essay. I was being too ambitious with such a broad thesis, and that this support had, quote, made me decide to swap my second degree so I can major in history as well. Now, it's never going to be that good all the time. That's probably statistically an outlier. But it's really nice to hear that actually giving individual personalized feedback, students feeling heard and listened to, really does impact their time at university and really helps them in their academic career, I think, as well. So that's a kind of history-specific one as well. I'll spend the rest of my time kind of basically dishing out advice to anyone who will hear it. First, to kind of tutors and people who might have started teaching or tutoring recently, or people returning to tutoring, things that they might want to think about, things that I have done and have wanted to do and have thought about maybe not doing in the future, and then talk a bit about awards. So, a whole bunch of unsolicited advice. The first thing I'd like to say is that tutoring is, I think, is always scary. There's almost no situation where walking into a room with a bunch of strangers is a completely fine, and it's usually people's number one fear is presenting to an audience of some sort. And it's also, for people who are tutoring for the first time, it's really hard to go from 17 plus years of being taught to finally finding yourself in a room of people often your own age or sometimes even older. But the flip side of this is that if you're here and if your school has enough faith in you to tutor, then you deserve to tutor. If you get into the room, that means you deserve to be there. Embrace the fact that your sort of peers and your faculty have the faith in you that they think you can go and teach here in particular. The other thing I think, as far as establishing expectations, the more I think about this, the more I think it's true. Explain to the class that you're not necessarily an expert in this subject area. Some students will perhaps idealistically go in and expect that you really know whatever subject you happen to have been assigned this semester, 12th century Norse mythology or whatever it might be. Explain to them that your role is actually quite different from the high school teacher that they had for the last 6 years. You're there to tutor the subject, you're there to mark their assessments, you're there to facilitate their discussions. That's really the key things that you're there to do, and usually answer their emails something like on time. That's your role, and the faster you can establish that it's different from what students might have experienced before, but here's how you go about doing it, the easier it will be for them, and the easier it will be for you to explain what you're actually doing. That's one of sort of the key things I've thought about in this particular area. The other thing, and I think this linked with what I was saying before about making sure everyone participates, setting those expectations from week one. In my case, every student will go to the lectures or listen to the lectures. Every student will do all of the readings and come prepared to talk about the readings. And every student will hand in the assessments on time. Understand that students might send you emails and might have reasons they can't fulfill those criteria, but effectively start out with that as a given. These are your expectations going in, and every single week that will be the expectation going in. Another thing, and these are quite minor things, these are quite micro things, learn your students' names as soon as possible. If you look at any of the surveys for why students drop out of university, loneliness is one of the biggest ones. No one knowing their name is a really big part of it. I'm not amazing at learning students' names, but I really give it a good go from week one onwards. And using different methods to try and remember their names, I think, is really, really good as well. But it can mean so much to a student that's come in, might not be living on campus, might have moved out of home for the first time. If at least one tutor knows their name, that can make all the difference in the world, because they might go home to no one, they might be just doing their subjects, away from home and family for the first time. Just having someone that knows their name really means a lot to them. Even though it's very hard to suddenly remember 92 students in a week, I think it's really important and a really good thing to do. My method up until last semester was to wait till everyone sat down, pass out a roll, and then everyone puts their names down, and then I kind of work out mathematically, all right, Jenny is number 1, and then that must mean that John is number 5, and then Tabitha is number 13 in my list, and 15 is Vince. And this worked perfectly well until I had to take 2 sets of classes at the same time. So there were 24 students in a class. We all sat down around a table, and then I had to try and work out on a square what number 13 was starting from John. I thought that system worked. It clearly doesn't. Other tutors have recommended to me getting students to just bring in their name in front and putting that out so you can actually see them. These sound like micro things, but I think they're really important to getting students engaged and getting to know their names as soon as possible. My other general advice for people starting or returning to tutoring is use a combination of pair work, group work, class discussions, depending on both your style and the style of the class. Some classes you go in and they're immediately ready to discuss everything straight away. They've all done all the readings. They're all well above with everything. And you don't necessarily need to do the kind of pair work that gets students motivated enough to talk in a class. Some will just do it whether you like it or not. Other classes are much more difficult to get a kind of robust class discussion, so use at your discretion different forms of sort of group work, pair work, large class discussions, things like this, and that no 2 classes will be exactly the same. And almost always, every time I talk to another tutor, a thing they say is, I've gone from this one shoot where everyone was talking, and I sat down really excited, and no one wanted to talk. And if you are not prepared for that to happen, it's going to be really tricky. But basically prepare for a class that's not going to talk and then sort of work accordingly. That's kind of some general stuff that I've learned in my years as a tutor. I'll talk now about some things that I would like to have done more of now that I look back in the measure of the years as I'm now sort of looking back at my tutoring time. One of them would definitely be more interactive learning, talking to the iLeap people in particular about some of the ways that these digital technologies can be involved in this sort of tutoring process, the hands-on real-life approach, peer marking, which I think can be a really useful method at some points in time, cooperative learning, in particular with other disciplines and other subjects, self-reflective assignments and projects with students from different disciplines. I think even though as a tutor you're not necessarily at liberty to start making very radically different assessment kind of processes, but that's something that can really, I think looking back, could have had a really positive impact on some of my classes. Some of the classes that we teach at the ANU also can be counted in different majors. So when I taught the Cold War, 3/4 of my students were from international relations. It will be a really interesting exercise to do something like to look at a current policy problem, use some of the history students to write the background aspect of it, and then use the IR or policy students to try and figure out what the implications of this are in the real world. Actually using the fact that a lot of our classes are very diverse and have students from very different backgrounds to our advantage, I think is something I didn't do as much as I could have, and is something, if I go back to tutor, that I definitely will try and do. The other thing is to, and this is for early career researchers or full professors or anyone, more networking with other tutors and lecturers. If someone's taught your course before, have a chat to them about what they found good and bad. It's really often as simple as just having a cup of coffee with someone, but just discussing the problems or the issues that they had in that course and how they might go about solving in the future. Because in a lot of cases, subjects are taught by someone for 1 or 2 years or for a long period of time and switch. Those people have incredibly valuable knowledge, whether they be tutors or lecturers, on how to go about these subjects. The other one that I should have done more of, I think, is more mid-semester feedback. So certainly for the first 2 years I did tutoring, I basically relied on my CELT results at the end of semester, but you actually have a perfect sample size of your students the whole semester long. So trying to get feedback often at the mid-semester point is really good, because if something isn't working in your class, it's probably going to not keep working from week 7 to 12 just as much as it had in the previous weeks. Finding out as soon as possible what students think are working and isn't working is something I think I could have done more of, certainly. Another thing that I should have done more of, it's like confession, is nicking more ideas from fellow tutors. So, for example, in the one subject that I taught, terror to terrorism, Will, over there, who I'm pointing to, wrote his own mini manual of how to write a history essay. In another subject that I taught last semester, called Nazi Germany, another tutor called AJ America wrote AJ's Great Guide to Essay Writing. And if, in lots of cases, if you don't ask for these materials, they're there and you just don't have access to them necessarily. So talking to your fellow tutors, talking to your fellow subject conveners about some of the materials that they might have actually done, because there are incredible amounts of knowledge and resources out there that you can actually use and learn from some of the people who are really, really sort of useful in that area. Things I would like to have done less of. Less pair work, I think. I was always a bit obsessed with making sure to get through the lecture, talk a bit about what happened in the lecture, and then talk about the primary readings, and then talk about the secondary readings. Pair work can be good, but when you've got a class of 16 or 18, it can take up about half the class just to get through the fact that you had a lecture. Going back to the expectations thing, if you expect them all to have gone to the lecture, then you don't need to spend a huge amount of time which I often did, actually going through and making sure everyone understood every single part of the lecture. They are adults, you can have the expectation that they've gone to the lecture and maybe go through some of the key points so that students that didn't are still able to participate in class discussions. I think the other one is less time stressing about getting through all of the readings in excruciating detail. I find this in humanities in particular. If I get to the end of a class and I've only had a minute or two to discuss the final reading, I often feel very bad. Have I endangered their education? I mean, again, the expectation is that they've done all the readings. You can always send an email outside of class saying maybe you want to think we didn't have as much time to go through that reading, maybe have a think about these kinds of questions, and maybe we can even talk about it again next week. But you can try your best, and each class is different. Some classes will just talk a huge amount of time about one reading and will not really be interested or want to go through another. So sort of playing it by ear in that way. Less kind of summarizing lectures in class. Any questions so far, anyway, out of interest? Reasonably good? I shall continue. Here's some things that I think, this is where it starts to get a bit preachy, but things that I think that lecturers could think about when dealing with tutors, and ways that lecturers can, I think, help tutors apply their skills as best as possible. So in my time as a tutor, I've had sort of different experiences of lecturers who've wanted to have weekly meetings, lecturers that don't care as much about meetings and things like that. And really, I mean, it is, of course, up to the lecturer what their kind of style is or what they think is good. But I suppose I want to speak in defense of a weekly meeting with tutors. Certainly at this university, I've taught a subject where the convener didn't actually teach any tutorials. The 10 tutorials were done with 3 tutors. Now, if one of those tutors doesn't actually go to any of the lectures, or 2 of the 3 don't go to lectures, you might show up to those lectures and not know that there are other tutors in the subject. That's quite a plausible thing, or certainly not know who they are. And I think, as I've discussed, they're some of the best resources for figuring out how to teach your subject, because they're literally doing the same job as you at the same time. So the weekly meeting is great because it actually gets everyone in the same room together at the same time and lets tutors actually figure out who the other people teaching their subjects are. I do know of tutors who never met the other people teaching their subject, and if you think about the amount of valuable information that other person could have had, that's something that could certainly be improved, I think, in that particular way. The other reason that I think it's really, really useful for lecturers to have a weekly meeting with tutors is that, particularly if you're not actually doing any of the tutoring, you will have the most up-to-date information about how the classes are going, what the issues are in class, how the readings are going is a really important one, because that's one of the best ways to improve the course, is to get as much feedback as quickly as possible on how the various readings are going. And tutors are, in effect, some of the best people to do that, because they are doing the job. They are on the front line, in the trenches of the sort of student education experience. So having that discussion of what worked well, what do you think didn't work well, and being willing to adjust that, even though you set the readings, how it actually worked on a level in the actual classroom. And the other thing that I think having meetings with tutors and involving them in the process is that they can sometimes have really good ideas about assessments. Not just in the sort of sense of sort of student learning, as was talked about before, but tutors are in a strange position because they're also have sometimes been students very recently. They might pick up on things that you may not pick up on. They may figure out things that students might be very confused about, or they will definitely answer in this way because everyone in all of my classes are talking about the Algerian War. No one's going to interpret this question as being about this. Tutors have incredibly good, they're in a great position to give you great feedback on the sorts of assessments that could work well and sort of some of those kinds of things. So I suppose in a way this is a defense of tutors as people who can be really, really good resources for lecturers and conveners to use because they're effectively doing a huge amount of the teaching, not just in CASS, but throughout the ANU. So go tutors, keep doing a great job. Oh yeah, and broadly some things, seeing as I literally have a pulpit, that the ANU might want to consider. So already done would be, I sort of mentioned this, but reforming the CELT system. So the new system is a bit more interactive and engaging. One of the questions on the previous one was, how do the lectures link to tutorials? And this was linked with individual student feedback, which is one of those things that for tutors we don't effectively control. So I think that's been a really good reform, and I'm really interested to see how the new CELT sort of scores are interpreted in those sorts of ways. But the other thing that I think that we found in history to be really useful last semester was a school-specific class that just dealt with issues in tutoring in a particular school, because the issues in history are going to be very different from the issues in philosophy, from sociology, and from various parts of CASS and around the university. So just having, say, a weekly meeting organised by a lecturer or something like that, that actually talks about the issues in the discipline at that point in time, we found that to be really useful last semester in history, and I think it's something that could definitely be done across the university if it's not already being done. The other self-reflective bit I suppose I'll talk about is awards stuff. So the first thing is definitely apply for every award that ever comes up ever in your entire life ever. Because the worst comes to worst is you get some feedback about how to do better at that. And you might have a good time and maybe even win some money. Who knows? There's only positive options that come out of it. My feedback on the sort of award applying for process is to, as soon as you can, from the moment you step in the classroom, start gathering information that will help you in your application. Save every email that any student ever sends you saying, I liked that assessment, or thanks for being a great tutor. Any of that stuff, I was told this and I didn't do it properly, but I should have. Make a folder where you just compile all the things, save the CELT results, make quadruple backups. Save the materials that you make in class for students. Sometimes you make them and then throw them away or delete the Word document. Save it all, because when it gets to the award applying process, they really need evidence to show that not just students are having a nice time in your class, but you've actually implemented really important sort of teaching practices. The other thing is to find your unique contribution. What are you doing personally in your classes with your own style and your own method that is different, that is unique? What are you bringing to this that other people might not be? So figuring out the fact that you are an individual tutor and that you have something really interesting and different to offer. The last one would be to don't be afraid to go really deep with the educational sort of research. It may not be the area that you're necessarily comfortable researching with. I certainly found the first time I tried to kind of read educational journals, my sort of brain melted briefly, and then sort of reconstructed itself. It can be really dense and really deep, a lot of the literature, lots of surveys referencing surveys and things. But if you can wade through it and find some evidence and use that to inform your teaching practice, that's going to be really helpful if you're interested in applying for awards in the future. And the most important thing is ask for feedback. I applied for the CASS Tutoring Award in 2017, thought I was in with a great chance, and 1,000% did not get it. And one of the key reasons are some of the things above. I didn't really use as much evidence as I could have. I didn't structure my sort of application in a way that used educational research especially well. And I asked Royston, I think sub-dean at the time or dean at the time, what can I do to improve? And that's a really hard conversation to have because so much of academia and life you're spent going, I think I'm okay and I'll just hang in there for a while and pretend that things are going all right. But having that conversation of saying, what can I do to improve for next time? I find it really hard. 90% of the time I don't do it. But when I did in this case, it was really, really useful. It gave me a way of thinking about these applications that I then took to the successful ones in 2018 and 2019. So have those reluctant, awkward conversations about what can I do to improve in the future. I think that's a really sort of valuable thing to think about. I suppose I wanted to say as well that the tutoring process and the awards application process, even though it can be just a thing that you sort of do while doing your PhD and it's basically just a way to make money, has a lot of different areas that can actually help in the kind of more practical rest of your life. So I was lucky enough to become an Associate Fellow of the Higher Education Academy with some help from some of the people from CHELT. So that's an officially recognised organisation. You get to put post-nominals, which is very fun on applications of things. This tutoring experience and some of the awards as well have led me to now work at the National Museum, where I'm working on the first of its kind digital classroom of Australian history, utilising some of my historical background. But they really valued in this particular job application the fact that I'd been a part of award application processes, been a part of the teaching process, and had actually been, in some ways, a co-creator of curriculum and giving feedback on sorts of questioning, sorts of assessments, things like that. So it's not just contained within academia that this is useful. I think this is useful for job applications and other things in the future as well. I'm applying at the moment for public service jobs because I live in Canberra and I think everyone is morally required at some point to have a brief public service job. And referring back to the tutoring process and some of these more engaged tutoring methods is really useful because all of those classic interview questions, when have you solved a problem? When have you collaborated with others? When have you had a disagreement that resolved in you changing someone's mind? All of these questions are the sorts of things you can actually answer if you kind of become engaged with tutoring and start to think about some of these processes in a different way than kind of box ticking. So it's not just useful for academia, it has all these other benefits as well. Here's the self-indulgence bit that I promised wouldn't happen, but is definitely happening. My great-grandmother is, I think, the person in the doorway. This is 1880 at Ingonia, which is beyond the town of Burke. People think there's nothing at the back of Burke, but Ingonia is beyond it. She married my grandfather, who came from County Cork, and they together taught at one-teacher schools around Western New South Wales. Their granddaughters, my mum on the left, who teaches at high school and university, my auntie Gabriel, who's a special needs teacher. The sort of hair gets bigger as it goes along. My auntie Michelle, who's a preschool teacher here in Canberra, and my auntie Loretta, who's a university lecturer and currently works in Kazakhstan. So they've all had kind of different educational careers, but I suppose the thing, and the reason I link back to this and family and things like that, is that what might seem to be a bit pedantic, a bit micro about, I want to make sure every student speaks in class, I want to make sure that you have all these plans going in. I think it makes a really huge difference to educational outcomes. Students are paying us a whole bunch of money to listen to lectures and to get assessment feedback and to sit in class and have a discussion. So if you can, I suppose, do what I've tried to do as well, try and make that discussion as fair as possible. Try and make that discussion so that everyone feels that they can be engaged, so that female students don't get talked over, so that international students don't get ignored because English might not be their first language. If you can try and create an environment in which that's something that sort of is expected from week one onwards, I think in certainly my family's case, it's sort of changed our lives forever, having those opportunities in education. And I would sort of hope and continue and thank the ANU for allowing us to become better tutors and try and fulfill some of those outcomes. So thank you broadly to the ANU for giving me the opportunity to improve my own tutoring through things like the Shelt workshops, through the fellowship, through the awards. I've been given so much support from various parts of the university over that. And thank you for listening to me speak, and I hope I wasn't too self-indulgent. Thank you. Excellent. And we have time for questions in case anyone has any questions. I can try my best, but I'm not really a sort of educational expert. I just taught a bunch. So if you have any questions or comments or queries, concerns, go ahead. Absolutely. I mean, that was certainly my experience in a lot of the case as well. The main thing that I look for in myself is what can the tutor do to improve in the future, and some of that stuff I've found to be really, really useful because, again, students actually have a chance to be kind of honest in this case. The fact that you have these different interquartile ranges and you get a kind of score out of 5 doesn't necessarily help you that much. If you're getting similar scores throughout your whole time, but you think you can improve, it doesn't tell you as much as other things could. I think the new system, is that they're starting, last semester, is working a little better. It's a bit more kind of holistic in what they're doing. But definitely the assessments as well, as I think are really, because that is effectively, there's not many other ways to actually measure whether or not they've fulfilled the learning criteria than testing them on the learning criteria and see if they've actually solved them. That's another thing as well, I think, as far as measuring your teaching and things like award applications, is recording your students' performances in class. That's something I think I could have done more of in sort of my time applying for awards. Look at the fact of what was their first assessment like, what did you add to their feedback, and then how did they improve or change by the time they get to their second and third assessments. Actually look at a trajectory in that way. But absolutely, it can tell you some things in a great amount of detail and leaves other than did they enjoy the class or not. In some cases doesn't give them as much of a huge amount of information. Oh, okay. So the question was, if I design mid-semester feedback, what would I have asked? I suppose the general one is, back to my kind of, I suppose it would be based on me, but my teaching philosophy is that, do you feel you're able to participate in this class? What could I do to help you participate further? What are your suggestions for class and maybe something along the lines of, which class activities have you found to be useful? Which have you found to not be useful? Because they won't necessarily tell you that in the time that they go. They will say, I'm enjoying or not enjoying the class. You know, if I'm doing lots of pair work in this particular class, or lots of group work, sometimes I'll go straight to group work, and a lot of times, are you actually finding this useful? So I would link it to that. Are the things that I'm trying to do, you know, fulfilling your expectations of the class, or fulfilling what you think are your learning outcomes? And then effectively leave a space for what do you think I could do to improve this. The tricky thing is then getting conflicting results from different classes, getting one group saying we love the group work, keep doing group work, and the other one says we hate group work. But maybe that's a case of actually tailoring that to each class, not taking that feedback and changing everything across the board, but it giving you an idea per class where you might alter things slightly, because what you think might be working well for that one might not for the other. But those would be the ones I would definitely think of. But I'd be interested to hear if other people had ideas as well. Go ahead. Absolutely. I think that's a really good question. And the question broadly was, how do you sort of keep students, engaged when there's confronting and often distressing things going on? I mean, I taught Nazi Germany. So we weeks 11 and 2, we have to do the Holocaust. In a way that it's all about finding that balance between making students feel comfortable enough to speak about things, but also not shying away from the seriousness of the topic. In that particular case, you don't want to sugarcoat it or not talk about certain aspects or not do certain things. I suppose in that particular class case, that one I tended to use more things like group discussion, where people could report back rather than talking on a personal kind of level about how they felt about the subject or what they felt was going on. That's what I tended to do for those ones, just because there's then a level between someone talking about something very emotional or in lots of cases, stuff that might have impacted on them personally or in their family history. The other thing I tend to say in the classes, and this actually happened to me because with my assessment rubric, I did this, and one of the students was talking about a subject they didn't want to bring up in the class, is say to them at the start, and email them beforehand if useful, if you don't want to talk about this, just let me know and I won't call on you. If you can give me some sort of, other than that, there's not much, I suppose, that I can think of off the top of my head that you can do to somehow go between talking about a really serious, difficult issue and not sort of bringing up terrible things for students. But that tended to be my way of doing it, was to give them an out and say, we're going to be talking about really serious things in this tutorial. If you don't necessarily want to speak on this topic, just let me know and I will, engage you in whatever ways possible, but I won't call on you personally. That's my technique. Did you have an idea of how to go about that? I think the case with that is always moderation. Step in at the point where they're starting to talk about either things that go beyond the scope of what we're talking about, or they start to get into personal attacks about things. As soon as someone starts to utter the phrase, "you only think that because," that's a time to step in. And I think particularly with those very emotional issues or those very contentious political issues, basically be hyper aware that these are hyper-partisan, hyper-emotional issues, and mediate as much as possible to bring back to the topic area, and then use comparative examples as well. That tended to be my way of going about this, because I think you can still have a really robust discussion about these things, and people still get emotional and fired up within the context of that, but really just moderate that and make sure that everyone's being respectful effectively, and call students out if you think they're not being respectful. Link back to the fact that in week one, we all have the chance to speak, we all have the opportunity to speak. Try and be respectful and talk about people's arguments and their points rather than them as a person. That's kind of how I go about that, but it's tricky. I don't know if there is any sort of one answer for that. Did you have a set way of going about that? Or? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you can sort of, I certainly found after a while, you can kind of get a feel for it. It will go to a certain point where it starts being much more about people's either personal experiences, or it's gone beyond the scope of what you're meant to be discussing in class, and then reining it back in and saying, okay, that's a really interesting point on that. If we just go back to this point now, and then maybe ask someone different or ask for a different sort of impact on that way. But I think that, yeah, basically you can go through those really controversial issues as long as you're willing to step in and moderate when things get heated. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the eternal problem, is that we're given, 2 hours of preparation time per first tutorial, and if you go to the lectures, your 2 hours is done. This is the what our generation's casualization sort of looks like in a certain context. Apart from changing the system fundamentally, I think exactly the things you were talking about. Talking to other tutors about the sorts of questions they asked in class. If you can have a meeting with your convener about how to go about those things. I mean, just from a practical perspective, trying to teach the same subject a couple of times so you don't necessarily have to redo all the readings. I mean, these are kind of small fixes, but trying to balance those times, and always, I certainly feel that always realizing that actually preparing more, I think 6 hours is a great way to think about it. I always go, it'll take about 2 or 3 hours. Actually being realistic about how long it takes to plan a class. Doing the readings is very different from planning the class. They're completely separate activities, but you need to actually sit and do that in order to do the other one to make the class sort of work. So the only thing I can say is yeah, try and develop good time management behaviors. Overestimate how long it's going to take to prepare rather than underestimate. And try your best. Other than that, I mean, it is in effect the system, and you can basically try and come up with as many things you can do to kind of solve that as possible. But definitely speaking to other tutors as well about how they manage their time and behaviour and how they assign that compared to their research and things as well. Absolutely. Going into a brand new subject for the 5th time is much, much easier than going into it for the first time. One of the reasons is that I certainly discovered as I went along that, and this may be a sort of white male privilege thing, but if I show up to a class in a collared shirt and sit down at the front of the class, they expect that I sort of know what I'm talking about. And you can actually, I think, build on that in a lot of ways. My nightmare scenario is always, I'll teach something and they'll go, but you're wrong about that and you told us that was incorrect and you're not prepared for this subject. These are the sort of nightmare 3 a.m. thoughts I always get with tutoring. They'll pick all your insecurities that you're going into in that first class, they will pick you up on. Almost never does that actually happen. Mostly they just think that you know a whole bunch about the subject and will be a pretty good tutor. So I think potentially as you go on, you realize that if you set up those expectations that basically what I do before class is I read the readings, I come up with questions, and I help you in a guided class discussion. That's my role, that's where it begins and ends. If I don't know something, I can find it out for you, or I can direct you to someone who knows more than me. And I think or ask them to find it out. Almost all of them have laptops. In 10 seconds, you can often find out when Louis XVI was executed or whatever question is like that. So I think if you maybe, again, it's not a perfect sort of response to your question about the time management issue, but if you can set those expectations early that you're not actually here to answer everything, you're not the sort of world expert in this area, you're here to go through whatever the readings are with them or what equivalent as that is, mark their assessments, and you're going to try your best, basically. I think that's the closest I can do, but I'm sorry if I haven't answered your question as well as I could. I mean, my method was generally to sort of basically come in class with a piece of paper and get them to fill out whatever things it is. Again, different, it sounds micro, but different coloured pens so they don't sort of know what my stuff is. And then ask sort of a series of questions. But that's something I think I could certainly work on in that way, is actually having more targeted things about which things are and aren't working, and definitely a lot more space for, because I tended to, I think at one point I had a smaller one which was kind of like ticking boxes of various things and a small space for them to actually say what they thought of the class. Whereas I think the much more ideal one, just off the top of my head, would be something where, how much are you enjoying this class? What are the reasons for this? What can we do to improve? A lot more open-ended, where I think they actually have a lot more input. But that's what I would kind of like to have done. I'm answering a question as what I would have liked to have done. But what I would have liked to have done would be to do that way, where they actually have a lot of space to talk about how they feel about the class, and particular back to, I suppose, my focus of, do you feel that you're being respected and included and able to speak and communicate in this class? If not, what can I do as a tutor to actually help you out? Yeah, that's what I would kind of like to do. I didn't do an amazing job of it, but I think that's the way I would like to improve for sure. Absolutely. I'll answer a bit and then I'll kind of open it up. So there is training, but it's not mandatory. I think that's something that the ANU is broadly going to work towards, as far as making that, if not mandatory, then very, very strongly recommended. So the main course that I've done is the Principles of Tutoring and Demonstrating course. Have you heard of that one before? Absolutely. Yeah, I fully agree. I think in particularly that recognising student diversity in the classroom. I mean, at the ANU College, I think I taught 80% international students, and then I came to sort of history and I taught sort of 5% international students, and there's very different kind of needs and requirements in those kind of different cases. So I certainly think that kind of that sort of level of training and that level of engaging with tutoring is really important. And sort of your earlier question, sorry, was about. Sorry, yeah, I basically to finish, yeah, I fully agree. The more training we can do, the better, and the more that I think particularly first-year tutors are actually aware of the things going on and the resources that they have at their disposal, which are many, the better that can actually be, I think, broadly speaking. I think that's all the time I have. Thank you all very much, and thank you for asking questions.